everyone, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. Before I forget, my English class that's here needs to read for Thursday, so check that syllabus. Trust me, you want to read for Thursday. Okay, so I'll be talking today primarily about my recent book, Bad Environmentalism, Irony and Reverence in the Ecological Age, which came out just about a year ago. And there's a few things that I need to say before I really get going here. Number one, I need to warn everyone that there's going to be some adult content, and I'm pretty confident that everyone in this room is an adult, so you've got that going for you. But there's going to be, for example, some brief and minor nudity on the slides, a few gross references, for lack of a better word, and so forth. I promise you'll survive, but I just thought I should say that ahead of time. Another thing to mention is terminology. So I'm obviously an academic, and we're notorious for using jargon, but I've tried to cut that sort of thing down and just speak plainly for a moment, but not loudly enough, apparently. So hang on to that for 1 second. Okay, so now you're just dying to hear about this adult content, right? But first I need to talk a little bit more about terminology. So I was saying before, I'm an academic. We're notorious for using jargon, and I've really tried to cut that out. But there's one term that's going to come up a lot that might not be part of everyone's daily parlance, and that's the word affect. Let me get back here. Okay, which is scholars in my field use as a kind of umbrella term to refer to both emotional and bodily responses. So tone, mood, feeling, attitude, and/or posture would be good synonyms here. And finally, before I started, I wanted to give you an outline, a quick outline of the talk so you know what you're in for. Number one, I'll start with the premises of the book and an overview of what it covers. Number two, I'll do a deep dive into a specific example from the book and some analysis of that example. And then I'll end by talking about two brand new projects that grew out of that book. And these projects are directly relate to the course I'm teaching right now on Native American literature, and that's why there's all these students here. So at first, it's not going to seem like this talk has anything to do with Native American literature, but I promise we'll get there. Okay, so premises to begin with. Everything is terrible and the planet is falling apart. If you've looked at the internet or a newspaper any time in the last decade, year, month, week, or day, you've seen that human and non-human animals around the world are facing environmental problems, including but not limited to air pollution, drinking water contamination, oil spills, drought, habitat destruction, species extinction, plastic pollution, overfishing, sea level rise, ocean acidification, and the big one, climate change. So it seems that we could use some environmental activism with all this stuff going on, right? And certainly that has long existed, from mainstream national groups like the Sierra Club to grassroots and local groups like Orange County for Climate Action. But wait, also, everyone hates environmentalists. They're gloomy and doomy killjoys who make us feel guilty by reminding us that everything is terrible and the planet is falling apart, and that we are at least partially responsible. Or this is what much of the Western public reports through various channels. They're sanctimonious, self-righteous, reverent, and sentimental. And environmentalists are also, if certain US pundits are to be believed, massive hypocrites who create trash and burn fossil fuels, even as they rail against those very things. So a few years ago, you may have seen cartoons like this. This is Al Gore, who was the star of the highest grossing environmental documentary ever made, An Inconvenient Truth, and the cartoon shows him getting off of his private plane and getting into a limo, and he says, "I'm here to talk about global warming and reducing energy usage." And just the other day, I actually opened a celebrity gossip website, and it was like I was having deja vu. It was an article about Prince Charles of the UK, and it said, "Prince Charles takes private helicopter to a Swedish climate summit," or whatever, right? So there's this sense that environmentalists are hypocritical, and they're all talk and not action and so forth. Okay, so it seems that we need environmentalism, yet there's something deeply wrong with environmentalism, or at least the more prominent mainstream strain of it. Enter the bad environmentalists. As I show in my book, a new wave of environmental activists and artists have been rejecting those affects historically associated with mainstream environmentalism. So gloom and doom, sentimentality, perfectionism, etc. and instead embracing irony, irreverence, glee, camp, absurdity, perversity, playfulness, imperfection, and humor. So I'll just introduce the couple things that are on this slide. On the upper left is a BBC mockumentary about veganism made by a vegan comedian. And you see that there's fake news footage here, and someone is saying, who wants to sit and watch an entire film about veganism? Which is exactly what you're doing if you see that clip, right? So it's a vegan film making fun of vegans. On the right, we have a pair that call themselves the Ecosexuals. This is Annie Sprinkle and Beth Stevens, and that's that minor nudity I'm talking about if you want to look closer or not look closer. And so their mantra is that we need to treat the earth like our lover, not our mother, because treating her like our mother has not been working. So they're trying to be playful. And just a couple more examples here to sketch this out. At the top, there's a comedy video that was on the website Funny or Die, and it's called The Black Hiker, and it's basically about a guy who's just trying to hike, and people keep coming up to him and trying to take pictures of him because they've never seen a black hiker before. And then on the bottom is a film called Peak. It was made by a German filmmaker, and it's a documentary about climate change. But it's very stylized, as you can kind of notice in this example. So he interviews people, and then he arranges them in these very sort of stylish ways that we're not used to seeing in documentary. We expect documentary to be very natural, and he poses people very unnaturally. So these artists and activists and texts are also very self-aware, and they often make fun of themselves. So I was saying before, Carnage is a mockumentary about veganism made by vegans. And that's this sort of self-reflexivity is what keeps them from feeling sanctimonious and from being accused of hypocrisy, as I explain in the book. They really don't take anything too seriously, including themselves. As you can see from those examples, I find this phenomenon to be quite widespread, spanning roughly the last 4 decades, and popping up across everything from poetry and novels to stand-up comedy and memes. And I should mention here that I look mostly at English-speaking Western sources, so from the US, Canada, UK, and Australia, since that's my area of expertise. But there's also examples from Germany, like that, the bottom image, Korea, Mexico, etc., sprinkled in throughout the book, because I really see bad environmentalism as a global phenomenon. And just one quick word here on the term bad, to be clear. I see these texts as bad from a mainstream environmentalist standpoint. They refuse what environmental humanities scholar Wallace Heim calls, quote, the conformity in how one is supposed to do nature-human relations, end quote. And they also do not observe the rules of polite normative society, what with their vulgarity and offensiveness, as you'll see more of today. But I think they're pretty interesting because I wrote a whole book about them. So the term bad is a relative term here. At this point, I'd like to give you a more in-depth example, or look at an example of bad environmentalism. So this is part 2 of the talk. And I'll use this example to talk about both the broader and more specific potential resonances of this phenomenon. What we're going to see in a second is a clip from Green Porno, a short film series launched by Sundance TV in 2008 that focuses on animal sexuality, reproduction, and bodily functions. And some of you have already recognize the face of its creator and star, Isabella Rossellini, from movies like Wild at Heart and Big Night, and TV shows like Friends and 30 Rock. So I'm going to pull up this clip. And a couple of things I'll ask you to pay attention to while you watch this clip are Rossellini's affect. So again, her tone or her attitude, as well as the quality of the sets and props. So here we go.
Add the shrimp. If I were a shrimp, I would be a male when young, but with age, I would become a female. I would have to get undressed, get rid of this tight armor. I would have to molt. And when soft and naked, I would mate. would hold my eggs tightly to protect them. Ah! A wee shrimp are fished by the millions with nets. For every shrimp caught, 10 other lives are lost. These wasted lives are called bycatch. I lost my appetite. What to do?
So, I think we all survived that. Okay, so hopefully you noticed that her tone is very ironic, it's very deadpan, it's very campy, right? It's almost like it's fake serious. And the sets are very fake, very obviously constructed in a kind of humorous way. So why do we care? Why is it so important that artists and activists like Rossellini are embracing affects and aesthetics such as irony and camp and humor? Put another way, why should we pay attention to something as frivolous and ridiculous as that green porno clip in a time of environmental crisis? I'm going to give you 3 big reasons. First, and I think most obviously, such works can help us avoid what scholars have termed doomsday fatigue around environmental problems. So yes, this green porno video is informing us about gloomy and doomy environmental problems such as the wastefulness of the global seafood industry and Western eating habits, but its mood is decidedly not gloom and doom or didacticism or teacherliness. We could also argue that works such as green porno are therefore more attractive to a general audience than, say, a serious and sober documentary, as well as more accessible, sometimes literally. So for example, you can watch the entire green porno series for free on the Sundance TV YouTube channel. Artworks like green porno also use irony, irreverence, absurdity, playfulness, etc. as tools of critique. And they critique not just anti-environmental forces, so wastefulness like we just saw, but also apparently pro-environmental forces. That is to say, they call out the limitations and oversights of mainstream environmentalism. But they do so in an amusing, sometimes indirect manner, rather than through the sanctimonious finger-wagging for which mainstream environmentalism is itself infamous. And you'll see some examples of this a little later in the discussion. So the last big reason why artworks such as green porno matter is that in embracing modes like irony and absurdity, they actually remind us of the ironies and absurdities surrounding environmental crisis. In other words, they're kind of adopting the modes of the times to talk about these times. For instance, there's been a widespread assumption that if you just educate people about problems such as bycatch or climate change, they'll do something about it. Scholars call this the knowledge deficit hypothesis. But some sociologists, such as Kari Norgaard of the University of Oregon, have found that people actually tend to freak out and get emotionally paralyzed if they're overwhelmed with info, meaning that the more you know, the less likely you may be to act, which is pretty ironic, right? Or to get a little more controversial, think of how some of the people in our federal government, such as in the Environmental Protection Agency, are or were before they resigned, climate deniers and big oil supporters. Whether you liked him or not, Scott Pruitt was not the most obvious choice to head the EPA. Pretty ironic and absurd. So embracing irony and absurdity, I argue, is a way for artists and activists to point out these real-life ironies and absurdities. So thus far, I think I've given you a pretty broad overview of bad environmentalism as a concept and why I think it matters. I'm going to zoom into the book a little bit more for now, into chapter 2, to give a more detailed and contextualized reading of green porno. As I will show, an artwork like this matters not only in the grander political scheme of things, as I've just indicated, but also in terms of specific artistic and entertainment genres. In this case, nature/wildlife programming. And by nature/wildlife programming, you all know what I mean, I think, which is live action film, video, and TV about nature and animals, such as that you see on the Discovery Channel or through the Disney Nature film brand. The second film is on Netflix right now, if you're curious. A few words about the classic conventions of the genre are in order so that we can see exactly how green porno reacts against those conventions. Cultural anthropologist Louise Vivanco summarizes those conventions as such. Quote, a didactic stance involving the paternalistic and disembodied male voiceover narration, the close association of the film's knowledge claims with scientific authority, although scientists are rarely visible, situating the viewer as an observer, not an interpreter, and the last two, a narrative style that often focuses on an individual member of a species and decontextualized visions of sublime nature devoid of humans, end quote. Additionally, media scholar Richard Kilbourne tells us that with the exception of certain behind-the-scenes segments aimed, for example, at showcasing a new filming technique, quote, a discrete silence is usually maintained in nature-wildlife programming, especially regarding how certain shots may have been obtained and what criteria were employed in the assembling of particular sequences, end quote. The overall aim here is to give audiences the sense of seeing, quote, what would naturally happen in the wild, end quote. As I've already hinted, green porno defies many of these classic / nature wildlife programming conventions, thereby reflecting critically upon them. So let's start with that notion, oops, my screen has gone blank, there we go. Let's start with that notion from Kilbourne that nature / wildlife programming aims for a natural aesthetic. For the most part, green porno does not film or otherwise seek to represent the real outside world, though of course it refers to it. And as we noted, its aesthetic is exaggeratedly, humorously constructed and artificial. Underwater segments seem to be filmed in front of blue or green bed sheets or construction paper, for example. And Rossellini's appearances as animals are impressionistic at best, as these paper hats that signal her status as a limpet indicate. Let's see, and then we've already seen this one. Even in relatively realistic settings, such as the kitchen, where Rossellini has her I lost my appetite moment in that previous clip, every detail is painstakingly rendered in anti-realist or even surrealist fashion, from the hanging pots and pans that appear to be fashioned from foil to the sliced tomatoes made of paper. Wires, strings, and other riggings are visible, highlighting rather than dissimulating the fakery. As set designer Andy Byers told Filmmaker magazine, quote, I think it's so much fun to see the wires that make things move rather than doing it with a computer. If we can't do it live on camera, we don't do it. By pointedly not even trying for naturalness, green porno indirectly asks us to reflect on how much effort nature / wildlife programming typically puts into looking effortless or natural. Green porno's constructed quality has additional implications, I think. For one thing, the project invokes aesthetics particularly associated with children, play, craft, amateurism. Indeed, especially in segments that employ elements such as a spotlight and shadow play, which we see in this slide, green porno is reminiscent of a school play. The project's focus on sex, reproduction, bodily functions, etc., thus plays as particularly perverse in juxtaposition to this aesthetic and, depending on your sensibility, particularly amusing. And that brings us to another implication of this artwork. Green porno has a perverse interest in the obscene and the repulsive, an interest that counters the typically family-friendly vibe of nature / wildlife programming. Sometimes this interest means undercutting the sanitized, sentimental treatment of sex and reproduction that we find across this genre. So we can think back to something like Growing Up Wild. And I should say that we see this kind of family-friendly sentimentality across mainstream environmentalism. So I'm counting nature-wildlife programming as just one iteration of that. We can think of it in phrases people say like, we need to save the planet for our children or for our children's children, right? This idea of sentimental reproduction, but that's sort of a side note. Okay, so where was I? Green porno undercuts the sanitized, sentimental treatment of sex and reproduction. So one short film in the series, for example, leaves us with the image of Rossellini as a bee bleeding to death after having had sex, which apparently is a thing that happens. So I had to juxtapose these images to each other to really capture that difference there. And the series' short film on flies ends unceremoniously right after Rossellini declares, our babies grow up in cadavers. They're called maggots. Sometimes this obsession with the obscene and repulsive means a focus on bodily functions, as I've suggested. In the green porno film, short film on snails, for example, a costumed, contorted Rossellini reports, "If I were a snail, my anus would end up on top of my head." As colorful excretion squirts from a puppet-esque opening above her, she winces and completes the thought with a croak. "Unfortunately." Set designer Byers further describes the scene as such. "There's this soft focus glow, which is super corny, but then she poops on her face." Byers thus articulates the centrality of unexpected juxtapositions to green porno, the serious and the unserious, the high and the low. But while his comment seems focused primarily on formal film aesthetics, so namely the play between lighting and mise en scène, it has much to say about affect. Through mechanisms like that soft focus glow, green porno invokes the sentimentality, corniness, and other typical affective appeals of nature/wildlife programming, and then almost literally poops on them. Now, lest green pornos start to sound crude and careless to the point of being anti-animal or even anti-environmental, we might consider environmental theorist Timothy Morton's claim that, quote, "Putting something called nature, capital N, on a pedestal and admiring it from afar does for the environment what patriarchy does for the figure of woman. It is a paradoxical act of sadistic admiration," end quote. Whether consciously or not, Rossellini recognizes the need to challenge the sentimental, sanitized admiration of non-humans found in mainstream nature/wildlife programming, and to embrace the fact that animals are gross, messy, and not always family-friendly, just like humans. So what's the big takeaway here? Is bad environmentalism the answer to everything? Do we need to just start watching Isabella Rossellini videos instead of Al Gore documentaries, and then we can save the bees and the whales and the world? Sadly, I don't think it's that simple. What I'm really interested in is how artworks like green porno diversify or add alternatives to the affective and aesthetic palette of environmental art and activism. I'm interested in what they're thereby telling us about the status quo, about how environmental art and activism has typically looked and felt. And unlike some other scholars in my field, I'm not actually interested in judging these artworks primarily by their functionality. So for instance, their capacity to educate the public or spark measurable change. But I don't want to sell them short. The artworks in my archive demonstrate first that we can engage with serious issues in ways that are unserious, pleasurable, and entertaining. And they also potentially do a lot of things that we might actually overlook if we focus strictly on functionality. So these artworks can bear witness to crisis, enact catharsis, provide comic relief, raise activist morale, build community, serve as cultural diagnoses, model flexibility and creativity in the face of crisis, and inspire what geographer Shiloh Krupar calls artful endurance. So now we're at the point in the talk where the students in my class are wondering, what does this have to do with Native American literature? Why did you drag me to your talk this morning? Okay, you liked it, okay. So fear not, we've made it to part 3, the last part, where I'm going to tell you about how this book project, Bad Enviromentalism, spawned 2 new projects centered on Indigenous or Native American cultural producers. The first project is an article on the Kumeyaay poet Tommy Pico, and the second is an interview with Crow, aka Apsalica artist Wendy Red Star. In both projects, I focus on how Pico and Red Star use a lot of the same affective modes I've been talking about, like irony and humor, to critique the well-worn trope of the ecological Indian, or what is known as the romanticized notion of Native Americans as one with nature. Now, in one of the chapters of Bad Enviromentalism, I do talk a lot about this trope and how other Indigenous cultural producers, like the comedy troupe 1491s and the writer Vine Deloria, address this trope. But as I'll explain in a little bit, I didn't include these 2 figures in this chapter. The chapter built a foundation that allowed me to later recognize what they're doing. Okay, so we have to step back for a second and say, okay, what is the ecological Indian? What am I talking about? Probably the best known example, does anyone here remember this advertisement from, yeah, okay, awesome. So it was a famous anti-littering commercial and billboard from 1971 that started airing frequently or being shown frequently in the United States starting on Earth Day. It's a bit of a cliche, and some of you already know it, but it warrants a summary here just in case for those who haven't encountered it. The commercial begins with an indigenous man in traditional garb paddling down a river in a canoe as dramatic drum music plays. Soon we notice trash in the water. The camera pulls out to indicate evidence of modernity. First, power plants, later, a freeway. A car passenger throws a load of rubbish out the window that lands at this man's feet, and the commercial ends with a close-up as a single tear crosses his cheek. You can kind of see it. I know it's a little pixelated, but I think you can see it on the right. Close to idyllic nature and horrified by modernity, paradoxically existing in that modern world but stuck in the past, this figure exemplifies the ecological Indian. Of course, indigenous peoples do possess valuable and unique ecological knowledge that should not be discounted, although it historically has been discounted. But the trope of the ecological Indian is nonetheless harmful on multiple fronts. To reference Seneca scholar Mishuana Goman, it evokes, quote, a nostalgic past and constructs indigenous cultures as stagnant, end quote. To give another example, it conceals environmental injustices experienced by indigenous peoples. As environmental studies scholar Sarah Jaquette Ray explains, quote, reserved tribal lands contain the majority of US natural resources and have been primary sites of nuclear weapons testing and nuclear waste dumping. We could also think about things like the Dakota Access Pipeline that became very controversial recently. Despite these realities, mainstream environmentalism has often relied on the symbol of the Indian as an emblem of healthy nature-human relations. Thus, the movement obscures indigenous issues even as it uses the Indian as a symbol for its own agendas, end quote. My work on these two figures, Tommy Pico and Wendy Red Star, are really just in their early stages. So I'm just going to give you a quick introduction to how I see them addressing this trope. So first, Pico's 2017 book-length work of poetry, ironically titled Nature Poem, is full of sassy, shocking lines such as, I would slap a tree across the face, I say to my audience. So tree slapping is, I don't know, like a counterpoint to tree hugging. I'm not quite sure why it's tree slapping, but in these two lines we find first, sly pleasure in exploiting the preconceptions of Pico's perhaps predominantly white audience or mainstream audience, and second, a recognition of his status as someone constantly negotiating the whims of that audience. The latter point becomes more explicit in later lines such as, quote, I can't write a nature poem because it's fodder for the noble savage narrative, end quote. Pico is thereby trying to capture a particular bind that he and other indigenous and Native American artists find themselves in when it comes to public reception. If one acts like an ecological Indian, that might mean betraying oneself and one's community by playing into stereotypes. But if one does not act like an ecological Indian, one might not, for example, land a book deal or attract a mainstream audience because one is not fulfilling the image that people expect or want. Perhaps Pico is quite the marketing genius then, in titling his book enticingly Nature Poem, and then going on to deconstruct that genre inside its covers. Later in the poem, we find Pico's speaker clarifying, quote, there's something smaller, I say to myself. I don't hate nature at all, end quote. In other words, it's not nature that's the problem, it's expectations around nature. It's not ecology, it's the ecological Indian trope. I see Red Star as doing similar work to Pico, though through different media. Here, this is Red Star's photo series, 4 Seasons, in which we encounter what seems to be an idyllic, typical, and traditional scene of a Native American woman in harmony with nature. But as we look closer, we see that the grass is astroturf. The animals are plastic blow-up simulations. And the backdrop is a printed poster of some kind. So if you look kind of, it might be hard to see, but in the middle, and then sort of, there's kind of like quadrants, right, where you see like a wrinkle, like a crease that seems like it's a poster that's been folded. Red Star hereby counters the romantic idea of Native Americans as stuck in a stagnant past by surrounding herself with ample evidence of modernity, and kitschily, ironically so. When I first learned about Pico's nature poem, I have to admit that I was a little chagrined, even though I think it's fantastic work. It came out just after I had turned in my final manuscript for Bad Enviromentalism, and it would have been the perfect text to include in that chapter I mentioned, so a little bad timing there. I also wish I had had the time to write about Red Star, who has been working for much longer than Pico, but whose work I similarly did not encounter until I had almost finished Bad Enviromentalism. But I've come to think of these examples less as missed opportunities and more as proof that this concept of bad environmentalism, whether we like it or not, has become a major and ongoing contemporary mode of expression. Though individuals might use it for different reasons, in different cultural contexts, and to different effects, it's clear that a significant portion of the population is tired of thinking about the environment through a purely doom and gloom lens. They want to experiment with what irony, humor, playfulness, and other related affects can bring us, even or perhaps especially in times of unprecedented crisis. Thank you.